Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Althing Considered. Today, or tonight on Althing Considered, we have the pleasure with us of being with us Rabbi Chana and Professor Howard Williams. And we are here to talk about the most popular myth in Norse paganism, Ásatru, and heathenry. I'm not talking about the Trunskvita. I'm not talking about the Havamal. I'm talking about the myth of the sudden and violent conversion to Christianity of the Germanic tribes. Professor Howard Williams, I will let you introduce yourself and your background, and Hannah, you as well can introduce yourself and your background and expertise.
Hello, I'm Howard Williams. I'm a professor of archaeology with an expertise in the early Middle Ages, and I have taught and researched this field for over 25 years. I've published a whole series of books, book chapters and articles about both Anglo-Saxon England and pre-Viking and Viking period Scandinavia. I've also done field work in Sweden, Britain, and I've been on TikTok since 2020 trying to counter misinformation and share some reliable perspectives on the Viking Age and its archaeology.
Thank you. And Hannah.
Hi, I'm Rabbi Chana Johnson. I am a rabbi and theologian in Southern California. My topic normally is that of expanding the knowledge of Judaism and its place in progressive spaces, as well as the history of Judaism and its intersection with other faith dynamics. I received my PhD in 2008, but mostly my topic, my field of study, and what I do is interfaith work as well as the teaching of Judaism.
You all might wonder why it is that we have a rabbi, a professor, and a comms director in anything other than a joke. A setup for a joke. But no, you will find out later. In addition to being lovely people and friends, Hannah is here for a very particular reason that we will get into as we discuss the historicity, because it is important. It is important to address. So, Howard, I'm going to kick it off with a question to you about what is the Viking Age, and why is it why is it capture people's imaginations so much? Again, it's a relatively small part of the overall Germanic picture, but it captures so much attention from media, from our faith, and from popular culture. So,
Okay.
What is the Viking Age, and why is it such a so fascinating?
Okay, there's a whole lectures I can give on this, but the basics that I want people to appreciate is that almost everything we think we know about the Viking Age is a product of 18th, 19th century romantic nationalism and racialized understandings of the past that fed into 20th and 21st century popular and political discourse. Right. So you cannot escape. And I hear a lot of popular commentators say, oh, well, extremists have appropriated the Viking Age, whereas our true knowledge, no, that line just doesn't happen. Everything we know about this period is constructed around these 18th and 19th century frameworks, linguistic, historical, and archaeological. And we are drawing off that. And the reason why the Viking Age is of such appeal and such draw is it's a hydra of appeals. It appeals to our sense of origins, our sense of nostalgia, our sense of spirituality. We search into that period across Europe and beyond. It appeals globally now. And so it appeals to on so many different levels. But in traditional terms, the Viking Age is actually, as you say, a very small part of the story of Northern Europe, its interactions with Eastern Europe, with Western Europe, with the North Atlantic, and very briefly with what we call the North American continent. But it draws us in because it's kind of a national origin moment. It's a time where prehistory ends and history begins for many popular audiences, including those school kids who are taught about the Viking Age in, say, part of rural Denmark, or if you learn about the Vikings as ancestors of your nation, or as the enemies of your nation. So if you grow up in England, you might hear about the Vikings, but as the enemies of the Anglo-Saxons. Or if you grow up in perhaps a part of Galicia or a part of France, you might hear about the Vikings as marauders, as enemies who the early part of your nation fought out and carved itself an identity against. So as both antagonist and protagonist, the Vikings appeal to us because they capture sort of a certain set of associations with freedom, with origins, with identity, with spirituality. And that's not to denigrate anyone who has that appeal. I love the Viking Age because for the same reasons, it's a fascinating period of change, of transformation, of the origins of much of what is modern Europe, and how Europe then subsequently interacted with the rest of the world in the modern era. But we need to be aware that this began, this passion, this interest in the North, the northern peoples, has deep roots in this 18th, 19th century birth of nations.
Yeah, and speaking of the Viking Age's beginning, there is now a kind of persistent, as you say, you fight against misinformation on the Viking Age. There's a persistent now narrative of the Viking Age was a response, a
Yes.
militaristic response, far from being a disorganized raid.
Yes.
It was an organized military campaign against Christianity,
Yes.
to keep them from encroaching on pagan lands. And it was if I'm understanding correct, a retaliation for the demise of the Saxons and their absorption into the Carolingian Empire.
So one of the most seductive myths, and most I found both academics and popular audiences have been a bit blindsided by and don't seem to quite realize how pernicious it is this myth of retaliation against Christian expansionism. And this is a myth that is a problem because it captures almost everything about the Viking Age, from its very beginnings, the motive for why the Viking Age started, through to how it ends. That the Viking Age ends with the violent oppression of heathen peoples by a singly organized Catholic Church in modern parlance. And of course, I'm not denying the historical story of the raids begin on Western Europe at the very end of the 8th century. We now have archaeological evidence of at least one, if not more, generations of raiding in going back to the mid-8th century in the Baltic. And of course, we have the backstory that raiding was a thing for many centuries beforehand by Scandinavians and others. So the Viking Age didn't happen in a vacuum. But we have this story that the uptick in early raiding in the very end of the 8th century, early 9th century, is some kind of a response to Christian expansionism, which is a nonsense on many levels. And that through to the end of the Viking Age, that the Viking Age ends because suddenly everyone is suddenly under some sort of state organized repressive church that sort of blighted the land and washed away all traces of pre-Christian society and belief. And to both of those balances, and this is a myth, and I call it a myth because I think it doesn't mean there's nothing in it that is based in historical fact. It doesn't mean that it's there's nothing we know about the period that speaks to that. It's a myth because it leads us into a fantasy territory that is far removed from anything we know in the historical and archaeological record. And just to emphasize this, is that nowhere in the debates about the causes of the Viking Age that you will read in academic literature in the last 50 to 60, possibly even 70 years post 1945 will have ever evoked the idea that it was a backlash against Christianity. And yet here we are with YouTube, with TikTok in 2023, and apparently, and I said blindsided, many academics aren't aware of this, because I've talked to other academics who are experts in the Viking Age, said, are you aware that it's all because of Charlemagne? And because he, what? How? Yes, this is the thing, apparently. And I think it's taken a lot of people off guard. in the academic community too are simply not aware of how widespread this simple story of everyone sitting around a mead hall somewhere in the frozen north, like some sort of opening to a Hollywood film, going, the Christians are approaching, we must act, like some kind of white council from Lord of the Rings, or some kind of sort of war council of I don't know, some Star Trek universe. Everyone's going, we must do something about the planet Earth. They are starting to colonize. We must react. And like I don't know. It's really, really widespread, I find, and I think it needs to be qualified and countered.
So you said it's nonsense. Before it's kind of nonsense. What is it about the evidence we actually have about that period that really pokes holes and shows contradictions to that particular narrative? Like, is there, for one of them that I just know off the top of my head is that early parts of the Great Heathen Army were formed, because it was a kind of a conglomeration, but early parts of it were formed actually under I think it was King Louis. Who was like the grandson of Charlemagne. Yeah. So this great heathen army gets its start fighting for the grandson of the guy who killed the guy who supposedly killed the Saxon and kicked off the whole thing to begin with. But there has to be other kinds of contradictions and stuff that just
I haven't got a list actually, and I think we all collectively need to work on a list of issues to push back. But I think the first thing is, there was not the internet, there was not a phone system, that people did not have this ability. Secondly, that societies for centuries before and up to the Viking Age, there was no coherent Norse people. There was a language, there were contacts, there were communications, there were shared myths and stories, but there was no people sitting around going, our identity as a people is threatened. It's a very, and you have to be in a mindset where you don't understand that we're dealing with hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of years of different communities in contact. That Christianity is one of a series of Eastern mystical faiths that become popular in the late Roman Empire in the 3rd and 4th centuries, that by bit of luck and chance gets adopted as the official religion of the Roman world, and in the Mediterranean takes centuries to grasp a hold. No one in Scandinavia was ignorant of this religion, and in the same way that there's been debates, healthy debates, about the extent to which exposure to Mithraism as well as Christianity may have influenced northern belief systems as early as the 3rd and 4th centuries. But we're also talking simultaneously, people are trying to hold in their minds the 8th, 9th century, where Christian and Jewish and Muslim merchants are reaching Scandinavia directly. The trade routes that are extending from that 7th, 8th century world are long been percolating into Scandinavia before the raiding begins en masse. And then within the Viking Age, you have to somehow think that people in 3 boats raiding Lindisfarne in AD 793, the famous start of the Viking Age, have any contact or understanding of why people 2 generations later are joining the heathen great army. and then subsequently, you've got to somehow be in a mindset where you think that people in the 850s, 860s, 870s have any bearing on the motives of kings leading invasions of England in the 860s, 1060s. Sorry, this is such a big period of time, and I think people are trying to. A crude analogy would be to imagine that George Washington had a mobile phone and was calling up, almost West Wing style, sort of his chief of staff and going, "We've got to get President Bartlett on board with this attack we're doing on a West African state that's holding some Americans hostage." And you're going, "Oh, hang on, a few centuries have happened in between here." And so I think it's really, I don't want to sound too patronizing, but I think people are not only conflating space, communications, culture, and time. And if you don't have those building blocks of understanding how complex and how many centuries of exposure to different religions and faiths and how multicultural and diverse this Viking world was when we see it at its heyday in the 9th, 10th century, we can't even begin to have the conversation. So it's a myth because it's counter-historical. You've got to imagine literally almost a Hollywood sort of film style 6-month timeline in which the whole of 1,000 years is happening. I suppose that's my opening point, is people have got to understand the time and geography involved.
Right, and the first conversions of the Germanic people started in the, what was it, the 4th century with the Goths,
Yes.
right? I mean,
Yes,
this
of
is an almost 1,000-year period of not necessarily just, let's say, conquest of military campaigns, but also of the warband feudal structure of you would swear your fealty to a lord. For those of you who don't understand the feudal system, we're going to break it down for you. You swear your fealty to a lord. You promise that lord your service, that you'll do what he says if he tells you to do something, and you'll give him some tribute. This was give him some kind of, okay, I have this estate. I'll give you 10 sheaves of grain and a cow each year, and in return you get the protection of that lord. That lord is, he has to come to your aid. It's this system of relationships that existed in Europe before capitalism. Now I might be oversimplifying, but it was in basic, it was a system of relationships, familial relationships, oath-bound relationships. And when your lord converted, so if your lord says, I'm Christian now and I want you to be Christian too, your oath of fealty binds you to accept. Like, if he says go, you either have to do it, or you are now at war with now him and all your buddies who decided that they were actually gonna take the deal. Is that right?
I think, Ben, that is if you want to say that is what is happening by the end of the Viking Age, by the 11th century, we see the establishment of kings and their retinues and their followers. And if you're paying taxes via a church in a converted Scandinavia in the late 11th century, early 12th century, no one's going to be, you are Christian, right? You're Christian. You go to church, you're giving your taxes to the king or the tithes to the church. End story, game over. There's no point in trying to, but then equally, almost 99% of what you do when you decide to do your festivals, when you decide to do everything else, is going to be down to you. So one of the problems with this myth is, thinking about where societies in Scandinavia go in the Viking Age is, yes, of course they become Christian, but that is because of a structured system of power and obligation that is not down to personal faith. So you cannot frame the Viking Age and Christian conversion around personal faith, because often very few people are going to be going, oh no. I mean, it did happen, and we do have cases of this. Local chieftains going, no, I'm not going to convert to Christianity, and that's where things kick off. But most of the time, you just go, okay, I'm Christian now. Okay, whatever that means. And I think the challenge, I think, for groups of faith who build their structures of belief around the pre-Christian North is that it actually should be quite liberating to recognize that while Christianity was enforced, was violent, was sometimes by the sword in the 10th, 11th centuries, at that end of the Viking Age, when a feudal system is becoming much more firmed up, right? It actually should liberate people to realize that most of how you milk your cows, work your farm, say your prayers are going to be a very short flip, a very, very limited shift. Yes, the church did extract more tax, did extract more tithe, but that was part of us changing society in which the church was an integral part. So I'm not trying to let the church off the hook, as some people claim I do when I talk about these things. I'm trying to help people understand that for many people, there would not have been a dramatic moment of flux or change. And yes, I think the church was part of that hierarchical oppressive system. But equally, I think for many Scandinavians, this was a choice not made by some external world system power that's globally trying to oppress them. They would have been seeing that this is obligation to my lord, to my friends, my family, to my local society to accept this. And many traditional practices didn't stop. That's why we have sort of oral history surviving. That's why we have the folklore traditions, fragmentary in past. But a lot of that was repressed in the 19th century, in the 18th, 19th century, the very time when we see the idea of the Viking Age becoming popular. That was when a lot of rural practices were stamped out by authorities, not necessarily in the 11th, 12th century, where you must, yes, all right, there's certain things that the church didn't like sacrificing livestock, particularly horses, to particular named deities. Yeah, that's going to be out. You know, there's certain things that the church is going to go, we hear pagans do this. And yeah, hang on, we've never done that. Oh yeah, but I hear you sacrifice your children to whatever. I mean, they may go, well, no, that was something that was in the 5th century or 4th century text that you've been banging on about for 700 years. No one's ever done that up here, but whatever, we'll stop doing it. Okay. You know, and that's the point. It's we see this in culture wars politics today. So we need people on the left to stop doing this. And well, whoever did that? Or we need people on the right to stop doing this. Well, that is an issue, but really, is that what they're doing? Because I don't think they are. I think that's just more of a talking point. And I think that was happened. The church was its own echo chamber of text. Their idea of paganism, even when they had people in front of them, the Christian educated clerics will be taking their ideas of what paganism is from a hagiographic source about what happened to a missionary in the other part of Europe 500 years before. And so I think for most people, my point is that it would have been very slow, structured, and incremental change in the way they lived their life. And many of their traditional practices, they wouldn't have called, oh, this is a pagan way of doing things. The church did identify certain key characteristics as things they didn't want doing. Most stuff, they had not the power, nor authority, or ability to control or curtail. So most people probably just continued doing what they did. And I think that's really important, positive message that pushes back, you know, in a factual way. When we look at the archaeology, when we look at the history, people didn't just stop overnight doing most of their lived life because the church said so.
Chana, you had a thought. You had to raise.
I did. I was going to ask, do you think that some of this comes from the conflation of the idea that the church in that century was equal to the church during the Inquisition? Because it seems like is that some of these people are conflating the idea that people were being violently converted at the tip of a sword, rather than, okay, so I guess I'm Christian now because of my fealty to my community, to my, you know, my landowner, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think that there is a conflation between that and the time of the Inquisition, that they believed that the church during the Viking era had the same amount of power structure and influence that they did during the Inquisition, when that's simply not the case?
I think firstly, people are believing the sagas as a literal timeline of Christian conversion. That if you approach the saga traditions of the 12th, 13th century and later as a record of how it happened, rather than simply Christian Scandinavians writing stories about their kings and their deeds that are half remembered and fragments. And yes, if you see the traditional, firstly, there's an uncritical reading of our source material, as if Olaf Tryggvason converted Norway to this, then that's what happened. Not there were probably loads of Christians there, in the same way that the sagas of Iceland, the Icelandic family sagas, are totally contradictory. We know there were Christians there from the first settlers. There was no pagan Iceland. Well, there was, but most people were pre-Christian, were pagan in the late 9th and 10th centuries. And Christian conversion came with an imposition of the Norwegian kings. But we know there were Christians there on every level of society from the beginning. But you have to have this uncritical reading of the source material, which has been sifted through a nationalist and romanticized lens since the 19th century. And then you have to try and, as you rightly say, Rabbi, you have to have an understanding of the Christian church that is a mixture of 13th, 14th century, 15th, 16th century, 17th, 18th century, 19th and 20th century in your mind, with its structures, and putting that onto the 10th and 11th century. As many historians point out, if there was a concerted effort to convert the Scandinavians to Christianity, it was a darn failure, because it seems to have only happened by accident and by kings who have been around Europe, have become Christian, then using it as an angle to assert their power. The church is really useless. If they were trying, if the church of Bremen and Hamburg were trying to impose Christianity on the north, they were absolutely ineffective for generations. So yes, I think it is, yes, the church becomes a crusading and oppressive structure, but even that varies across Europe as to where and how it does that job. And I think we have to imagine a world that doesn't have that. No one's crusading into Iceland. No one's crusading into Sweden. In the Baltic states, in the late 12th, 13th century, Oh yes. And then you're seeing, Christian militarism and imposed Christian conversion by the sword. But the by the sword stuff happening in Scandinavia is by the sword of your own king, who's not by the sword of some invading Christian army of crusaders. So we have many layers of Christianity we need to sort of unravel. And it's easy to go, yeah, Christians, they genocided us. And then the ask is who, when, where? You mean Estonia in the late 13th century? Or are you talking about Sweden in the 11th century? Are you talking about England in the 7th century? Where is this genocide happening, and who are the central powers? And this is where I think the problem comes, really, is the end of the day, the crux is we are seeing that war council image. We're seeing a big table where everyone's sitting around planning out how to destroy people's lives. And that's, I think, a very insidious problem. No matter how much we may hate or dislike any particular religious group or cultural influence that's affected Europe at any particular point in history and then affected the world as a result, and we can pinpoint this is because of a particular ideology, no matter how much you hate that, pinning it on the agency of a particular group rapidly leads us into dodgy territory. And you can see how that gets manipulated by extremists to speak to hate in the modern world very quickly.
Yes. Hannah, did you have a follow-up to that?
I do. What my follow-up would be, what role do you think that modern takes, even, and I'm gonna say as far as even media, cinema, TV plays in the idea of people not understanding that it was not necessarily by the sword that Christian conversion happened in the 9th and 10th century, because we're so apt to believe what is shown to us as humanity now.
So I think our popular culture gives us many different stories of the Viking Age, and most of them are rooted in historical and archaeological realities. They are not completely detached. Even the Marvel Thor universe versions of Norse mythology, we can recognize the tropes, we can recognize the stories, mixed up, mashed up, but we can also see that Thor never had a winged helmet. That this is we can pick out some things as mythical tropes, but we can see other things, and giant goats that fly and pull wagons and so on. We can realize that didn't happen, right? But then there's lots of things that bleed in and merge in, and I think it is difficult for people to winnow out, to sieve out what they're seeing and what they're understanding. But I think most of what we understand out of the Viking Age is not because of the way the Vikings are represented in film. As you say, it's about the American West. It's about war films. It's you can take out all representations of the Viking Age from our TV and film history, and we'll still have, just to give an example, Clint Eastwood and John Wayne films, and that clash of cultures moment. There's loads of other genres, but I just come to that one because I'm talking to two people from North America, so why not? That is the way we think. And if you think about the whole of the colonization of North America in terms of the 7th Cavalry, people are going to go, we're not denying that there was fundamental transformation, genocide of cultures, and mass conversion and forced conversion, but that's one aspect of hundreds of years. But then if you try and impose that as a model onto other parts of the world and try and understand colonialism and conversion as flattened across time and space, and you give the same power and authority to kings in the 8th century as in the 15th century as in the 19th century, you're going to have a very confused understanding of the human story. And it's not something it's not me saying, oh, I have a more insightful view, everyone else is wrong. We're all struggling against this popular culture tropes, and sometimes it can be beneficial. I can use those analogies because sometimes those analogies are correct. Sometimes those missionary activities were violent, and we can say, look, if we imagine a particular part of northern Norway like Lada resisting Christian conversion, and you want to find a popular culture narrative for how this would have looked, look at some westerns and think about forts in the West, and think about the native peoples having to experience this kind of imposition of Christianity and violence in tight combo. You can find moments in the early Middle Ages that fit that narrative. But my point is, you've got to understand this as part of a broader process. So I suppose we can blame popular culture, but we're all part of it, and academics are influenced by it too. So I'm not trying to say we're outside it. We've just got to have the conversations about how we get these confusions and how we work with them, because none of us are above it or beyond it, but we're all part of our world, or we try to be.
Yeah. Chana, did you have a follow up to that one too?
I mean, I do, but nothing that is pertinent to the conversation at hand.
Well, I wanted to ask just because you touched on a lot of really interesting points, but one of the things that I had wanted to get to was about one point you made earlier about the kind of foil to the pagans. So the common conception is that Christianity, this foreign religion, was imposed on Europe, and Europe was colonized. Now, usually the question that I like to ask is like, colonized by whom? Because as you've pointed out, it was the kings who were, so it's like it's a Norwegian king converting Norwegian people to a different religion. It's a Swedish king. It's Icelanders voting to accept Christianity. They do it to themselves, but there's this insistence that there is this foreign power that is driving these actions. And this is where we get into the sinister territory of these tropes. You explained the stuff from the 18th, 19th century. Can you say like why these tropes came in, and who at the end of the day people seem to think is behind all of it?
Yeah. And so for me, we have to understand why people think this way, because around the world we see an increasing popular awareness of this, which in my generation has developed in a constructive way. Is that even a half century ago, 25 years ago, people were not talking on social media in such stark terms about imperialism, colonization, of the vast amounts of eradication of local people through disease, through violence. It's not just through directly imposed violence, but we've seen that conversation really develop, and it's a constructive and important conversation to understand the modern era and European, and not exclusively European colonization. But we know, I want to make that absolutely crystal clear that I'm aware and recognize why people are having this conversation and are wanting to reclaim their indigeneities, their native faiths and practices as part of a broader post-colonial clawback of the vast violence and eradication, and the church has been an integral part of this. The problem is, if we are trying to back project those structures over a millennium, conflate different periods of time, what we're doing is we're perhaps picking up on some of those positive, constructive conversations where we're increasing our awareness of the pernicious damage of our global world, and we're potentially, though, feeding into some very pipeline sensitive areas that feed us into a narrative of there is a single global power that's ruining the planet, that's destroying our climate, that's destroying our native free peoples. And at one level, it takes for some people, this takes the guise of any white person. Some people, it takes the guise of the Catholic Church. For others, it takes the guise of particular other religious communities. And the thing about extremists is they don't care about detail, they don't care about fact, they don't care. All they want is a single sentence narrative, and before you know it, the Catholic Church has morphed into the global Jewish conspiracy. These things are interchangeable in the minds of the historically illiterate and the hateful, and we have to be aware of how this narrative of the pagan tribes of Germania and then subsequently Scandinavia were oppressed. And I won't beat around the bush. This is a narrative you can literally pick up in the academic and popular literature of late 1930s Germany. It's there. Charlemagne oppressed the Germans, the old Saxons, by the sword, converted by the sword, in his expansion into Saxony. Scandinavia, the Germans rise up. Oh, did we talk about Varus and Teutoburger Forest in 9 AD? Oh, that was 800 years earlier, but that's part of the story too. The rising up of the Germans against the external oppressors, and the oppressors can be various. They can be Jewish, they can be Christian, they can be Mediterranean, they can be Roman, they can be Frankish, but whoever they are, we don't care, because we don't care about the detail. They're foreign, they're other, they're invading our lands. We in the pure north can rise up from our knees, as I saw one TikTok commentator say, and fight back. Oh no, it's not a hate symbol. It's just it was appropriated in the 1930s. It's a really positive symbol now. No, we know what this is. You can change the symbol, you can change the logo, but the narrative is the same. And I'm not saying that people that buy into see it for what it is, but it's literally there in front of our eyes. And we've got to be very, very careful about that narrative. It's not about what happened in the 9th century, about how we interpret a particular saga. It's how people are using that to directly feed into a pipeline that's being used by anti-Semites, by neo-Nazis, by groups around the world who want a single enemy that they can blame. And we know it's usually an immigrant, it's a person of color, or a person of particular faiths. But it takes on different guises and it's multifaceted. And at the end of the day, you have to remember they don't care about, they can't fact check away this hate. You can't say, well, actually, the Viking Age was more complicated than that. They're already not listening. But we've got to be careful that we don't perpetuate this with a sloppy, simple narratives. And that's where we can come in, at least, and have a conversation about this. Yeah, of course there was violence. Yes, there was forced conversion at points, at places. But be careful of where this is leading us, folks.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Sorry if that's a bit too stark, but I'm not trying to
No.
conflate anyone into that group. You know, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying
Mm-hmm.
anybody who is sympathetic to that narrative of Christian conversion in the 9th, 10th century is
Right.
necessarily of that mindset. But we've got to be aware of how this gets picked up and gets used in ridiculously counter-historical ways. And we go, well, how did you get to there? Doesn't matter. They've got there. They've got their narrative to blame someone that they don't want already.
And
they've already got in mind. I mean, yeah.
And as the kind of, I think you touched on one of the, I don't know, prototypical symbols of this, the Irminsul symbol. I think that, I don't know if that was the one you might have been referencing.
Yes, that was one of them.
But it seems to me to be emblematic of this myth making. It is, and people were for quite a long time, actually, in our community, people were using this symbol and saying it was this is definitely it's a pagan symbol. It always was a pagan symbol. That's not quite actually how it worked, was it?
No. So I mean, if you want to take that is one we can easily fact check. We can't fact check it all, but that is a symbol literally invented by a Nazi, right? It was invented by a Nazi from a piece of Christian iconography at the site of the Echtenstein, which is a natural rock formation that, because it's in vaguely northern Germany, is therefore has been guessed to be the site of the Teutoburgerwalder battle of AD 9, which is nothing to do with it, and we know where it is now, and it's quite a way away, but that's not the point. It's been seen, it's a natural rock formation with a late medieval hermitage there, so it's a Christian site. And since the 19th century, Nordic spiritualists and folklorists and archaeologists have tried to make it the site of the Irminsul. And the Nazis did excavations there, and they literally made it into a pilgrim site for Aryan Nazi myths of the pagan Germans based on zero archaeological evidence. I'm not joking, this is straight out of Indiana Jones. But rather than going to Egypt to dig it up, they had it in their own backyard. And it's really it's that simple. And there's a piece of iconography on the wall, medieval walls, showing a tree that's dipped in mourning, very stylized tree, like many trees in late medieval art. And I think it's Wilhelm Tude made this argument that this is a representation of the Irminsul, the pillar that was destroyed, the pillar of Jupiter, so to speak, that was destroyed by Charlemagne, which is nonsense. We have no evidence of this. So they've equated that Christian art with a symbol. He made up what it would have looked like originally, and this is the Irminsul symbol. Now, if you want to use that symbol, knock yourself out, literally, but it's not. You've got to be aware that this is a symbol literally made in the 1930s by a Nazi who was given a professorial title by Hitler to perpetuate a myth of a pagan cult site that doesn't exist apart from in their minds. It was made into a Nazi cult site that neo-Nazis have been visiting ever since as a pilgrimage site. And you've got to be, you don't have to know what happened in the 8th, 9th century. You just simply have to know what happened in the 20th century and know that if you want to use that symbol, go ahead. I'm not doing that whole, oh, you're trying to cancel our pagan symbols. I don't care what people's symbols use, but you've got to be aware. If you're using a symbol, take responsibility for where that comes from. And this, you don't have to be you don't have to sift back through like sort of Gandalf in the libraries of Minas Tirith, looking back through old documents. You literally have to go to the first source about this, and it'll tell you about the Echtenstein. But what was shocking for me when I did a video about this last year, and I said, look, this is literally a neo-Nazi. I have to be careful with what you say on TikTok, but so this is literally a Nazi cult site that's now a popular. But they had to, post Second World War, they had to literally rip down. The Germans thought they had to rip down all the narrative because this was completely fabricated. And people go, well, why? It's just an interesting site. This guy's just going on TikTok on a pilgrimage. Fine, if it's just spiritually inclined, it's a beautiful location, beautiful natural location. It probably had some kind of significance to people through time from the Mesolithic onwards. It's such a dramatic rock formation, and there's many parts of Britain where we have beautiful rock formations, and we can say, oh, it was a druid's temple, but you go, but was it? No, there's no evidence for it was, but it's a beautiful location. We can have our imaginations, but that's very different from having our spiritual connection to a beautiful place and going, oh, this is definitely where Charlemagne ripped down this. It's fantasy, but that's fine. You have those fantasies if you want, but just be aware those fantasies are shared with people who were literally exterminating large parts of European population and creating a world war. And if you want to do that, have fun, but you're going to be cool for what you are. But at the end of the day, it's that level of illiteracy of just, if you're going to use a symbol, just be aware of where it comes from. And you can't do the argument of this was just nicked by others. It was misused. It has a pure origin meaning. And for those, and this is about other symbols too, and I'm happy to talk about this in more depth at another time. But the problem with that, there was an original pure holy meaning, is that is the grift, that there was a pure holy meaning behind this symbol that was invented in the 1930s, literally made up in the 1930s. Claiming that is the problem, not those bad people took it. No, you're missing the point. So yes, of course there are symbols from the Viking Age. There's so many art styles and motifs one can use in one's faith, and I'm not trying to police and control people's use of ancient arts to inform their modern spiritual practice. There's so many diverse tropes and representations of animals, of humans, but if you want to use this very tiny few, you just need to be aware where they're from.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. You might not be trying to please. I might be. Now I'm at a loss for my next question.
Sorry, did I rant too long about
that? No.
If I may interject here, being the Jew in the room, oftentimes that is the excuse that is made from pagan folk, especially when we were talking about practitioners of heathenry, Norse heathenry, Norse pagan, however someone would like to label themselves in the Nordic faiths of modernity, is that it's okay if we use these symbols. You shouldn't be frightened by these symbols as a Jewish person, because we're reclaiming them. And when someone like myself says that something like that symbol was never anything other than something that was created by Nazis, oftentimes, especially in social media spaces, the Jewish people that I know of are often attacked. And we're said, well, why can't you just trust this? Well, first of all, when the first response to us, to any Jewish person saying that symbol makes us uncomfortable, that you say, well, that's a you problem, I'm going to do what I want, that's not really an argument in good faith. You're not actually engaging in good faith with anyone. And I do a lot of interfaith work. That is most of what I do with my job, is interfaith work. And I find a lot of people who want to reclaim symbols. And I am all for the reclaiming of symbols. By all means, play on, reclaim those symbols, take back the power of those symbols. But when you're told historically those symbols have nothing to do with pagan origins and everything to do with Nazi Germany, and you're telling me that I'm estupido, then the only thing I can say is that you are illiterate, or you're unwilling to face that maybe the context that you want to place on this is not historically accurate.
Yes,
And
I agree.
just
Yeah, sorry.
perhaps we might actually know what we're speaking about in terms of certain symbology, especially Jews. We are very sensitive to these symbols. They were brandished against us as a way of our own annihilation. Not and not just Jews. Let me just make that perfectly
No, no,
clear
no.
to your viewers. It was not just Jews who were terminated, unalived, murdered, slaughtered, however you want to put it in couch those terms during the Shoah. It was not just, but Hitler took a special liking to the annihilations of Jews that he did not take to the other minority groups. So, yes, we are very sensitive to those symbols. And when we say, hey, that actually never played any part in history prior to Nazi Germany, and you're telling us it's just because we want to control the narrative, perhaps the narrative that you're thinking about isn't historically accurate.
Yeah. Yes, and I also think that part of the part that this is so it's painful and it creates fear is the direct when you say that Hitler had a special interest, like the Nazi myth about Aryanism was set up as a foil against Judaism. That was their
Absolutely.
myth. That this was I mean, I hate to. I'm going to misquote the man himself, but he says in his writings that all struggle boils down to ethnic struggle. It's because he's arguing against the communists, right? And he's saying, no, they're wrong. It's ethnic struggle, and the ethnic struggle has always been, and eternally will be until one of them ends it, the Aryan against the Jew.
Yes.
And when you have these symbols on the one hand, which were created in the Nazi mythmaking, they are directly opposed to Judaism, because that was
Absolutely.
this myth was created. This myth of the Aryan identity, part of that was created as a foil against Jews. that was the purpose of that myth, was to unify a certain identity
Absolutely.
against another unified identity.
Absolutely against another identity. And we see, at least in my experience, in the conversations I've had, in the rooms I've been with not only with Norse heathens, but also with my fellow Jews and even with Christians, when I bring to light that no one is saying don't use your symbols. I have yet to hear, and I'm not saying it's out there. Please do not say, oh, Rabbi Hannah says it doesn't happen. Rabbi Hannah did not say anything like that. I have yet to hear a Jewish person say, do not wear your symbols. Just understand that in wearing those symbols, you may receive a lot of Jews who either don't want to engage with you until they know you better, or outright say, I don't want to engage with you at all for our own personal protection. You might be the nicest person on the planet, but if you are outwardly displaying a symbol, the symbol of our own destruction, the symbol of our own slaughter, why would I want to have a conversation with you? It would be the same as any pagan, especially not a heathen, who sees a symbol that outright, like, just flies in the face of everything they believe in, and that person says no, but it's okay because we're reclaiming that symbol.
I'm trying to think of a symbol that flies in the face of everything.
I suppose for me, it's if you are actually aware of the history of these symbols, that's one thing. But if you really don't know, then education is your friend, and that Google is your friend, and you can find this stuff out. And it's obviously the swastika is one thing, but there's a host of runes and other symbols, which it's not the symbol, it's the narrative behind it.
Absolutely.
And for me, as a historian and archaeologist, I'm not a specialist in symbols per se, but I'm acutely aware that going back to our original narrative, the idea that Charlemagne invaded Old Saxony, but destroyed the sacred temple of the Irminsul is historically verifiable, right? That happened. He slaughtered at a separate time. He slaughtered a range of Saxons, and this mass slaughter of probably leaders of the Saxons is taken as a Christian act of violence against pagans. Now that's fine. That in itself no, Charlemagne was an expansionist, Frankish, imperial. He was donning himself as a Roman emperor. He was an expansionist power. He was literally expanding and taking over other territory. He was colonizing the old Saxons. But then you need to look at a map, you need to look at a timeline, and you've got to work out how do we get from there to Nazi Germany and the Echtenstein site and this symbol. And it's only a few quick stops. And it doesn't mean that we have to deny there was violence in the Viking Age and the immediate pre-Viking Age. I would not want people to say, "Oh, would you love to go back?" And no, I don't want to go back in the past. I don't want the lack of healthcare. I love the NHS. I don't want to. I don't want to have to go back. And I like pizza. I don't want to go back to the Viking Age. It was horrible, right? No pizza, no NHS. I'm not interested. But in all seriousness, it was a time of gross religious hatred, violence, and but it wasn't framed in the modern way of understanding these things. And we have to understand that if you don't even know that a symbol concocted in the 1930s to invent a story about a site in Germany, if you don't, and then you don't understand how that is a problem for people in modern day Iceland, in modern day Minnesota, in modern day California, in modern day Venezuela or modern day Australia, and how it's being used, that someone will go into a place of worship in New Zealand with a battle that happened in 8th century modern southern France emblazoned on their weapon of mass killing. And you don't see the connection of how this early medieval story of Christians either fighting against Muslims, because remember, it's many different layers to it. Christian defenders of Europe against the infidel is rapidly flipped into pagan defenders against the Christians. This is all messed up. This is what's happening in our naive, historically illiterate 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, right? This and we can use these as literally on weapons of hate. We can't see that how this gets mobilized. Anyway, I could rant on and on, but I think the point is, it seems like just abstract historical ideas, but this has real world effects. And we're not just talking about people feeling a bit bad about symbols. We're talking about lives and lifestyles and cultures today. And that's where we've got to be aware that this stuff is heavy shit, to use a popular phrase. This suddenly becomes serious material. And I suppose, and I want to make a final point, is don't think that I think that academics are above and beyond this. We have created this problem. All of this 18th to 19th century scholarship that's informed 20th century archaeology, and now as an academic working in the 21st century, I'm only a couple of steps away, not only from survivors of the Holocaust, as we all are, but also from the academics that were digging these sites, were writing this material. Now, I've met them at conferences as old guys. It's a really awkward. I'm not saying I've met literal Nazis, but people who worked under the Nazi regime, who work in Scandinavia at the time, who were in correspondence. Like the last person who looked at the pots I studied for my doctoral dissertation was a keeper of archaeology at a certain British well-known city, who was in correspondence with all of the leading Nazi archaeologists in the 1930s, who was going around all the museums in right up to 1939, was in communications, I think even through the war. And so we are all implicated. We're all part of that messy story. And so how we talk about this, how we share information about the history of Viking Scandinavia or Germanic paganism has a direct connection to our world in so many ways. And we just need to be aware of that. It's not academics telling you shouldn't believe what you believe or wear what you wear or act where you act. It's about being academics trying to take some ownership for the problem they've created. And whether we're acting as historical consultants on the next Hollywood blockbuster about Napoleon or the Northmen, or whether it's our popular history books or our academic articles that are being picked up and read by enthusiasts who are getting the wrong end of the stick, we're all got a role. We're all part of the problem as well as potentially part of the solution of how we challenge these ideas.
I just want to say, if you have professor in front of your name, a rant is just called a lecture, I think.
I'm going to agree with. I'm going to agree with Ben here. As long as I've known you, I don't think that I've ever participated in a rant of yours, but I have participated in a great deal of learning from you, and it's always been an honor for me.
Yes, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so glad you're here, is because you don't just address like the history of the symbols, but the history of the history of the history, the story about
Yeah.
the story, because we don't always realize that history is itself a story and is subject to things like myth making, is subject to interests of building, as you were talking about before, building this national identity, this sort of white national identity that this myth making takes part of, and the oh wow, I lost my train of thought. It's almost 1 a.m. here. That's why I lost my train of thought. Kind of, did you have other thoughts? Well, I guess sort of gather mine.
Well, as we see these, we also see this as Professor mentioned earlier, we see this jump between the idea of it was the Christians to it was the Jews. And even now, as late as yesterday, I was combating the idea that it was not actually the Jews who killed Jesus. Like, this is 2023. We live in a time where information and education is at our fingertips. You know, I went to school in a time where there was no Google. There was no Google Scholar. I had no access to information at my fingertips. I was still going to university at a time where I had to go to the library and I had to look at microfiche. I don't know if either of you are old enough to remember microfiche.
I mean, it was there. I knew it existed.
We looked at it, but we knew it was there.
Yeah, I looked at actual microfiche to look at old records, to look at copies of the Dead Sea Scrolls in order to combat and learn what I did. And here we are in 2023 where anyone can literally have at their fingertips. I carry around with me at all times a computer in my hand. And the amount of misinformation that I combat on the daily basis, the amount of ill-educated people who have no reason to be ill-educated in these subjects is outstanding to me. We still live in a world where people believe there is a cabal of Jewish people who are running the world. And when I ask him the simple question, if you believe that Jewish people are somehow secretly running the world, why is anti-Semitism so prevalent? They have no answer for me. Don't you think that if we ran the world, if we actually had the space laser that Marjorie Taylor Greene insists that we have, why would there be any anti-Semitism? There wouldn't be. If I had control of the world, the first thing I would do is eliminate war and hunger and prejudice. I mean, these are things that would be at the top of my list. But what happens is, and I hate to say it, there are no pagans who have not really converted in modern time. There is Christian influence across the global landscape. No matter if you're Jewish, Muslim, pagan, Christianity has rubbed up against your faith, has rubbed up against your ideals, and has implanted certain things that we just take for granted. One of those things being that Jesus was killed by the Jews. So even if you've escaped that, let's say you were raised a Christian person and you have left Christianity and you have entered into another faith tradition, no matter what nature-based faith tradition that is, or animism, or Norse, Germanic, Teutonic faith tradition, you still have to undo the learning that you had as a Christian person. And a lot of Christianity teaches that Jews are responsible for the death of Christ. Even if you disagree with that and you say, you know what, I don't believe that, there are still subliminal messages that are happening inside of you where you believe, well, maybe they didn't kill Christ, but there is something a little off about them. And we hear it in just general parlance. We hear things like Jews really love money. We're skinflints, you name it, and it happens across the board with any, and not just Jews. I want to make it clear that while I am a Jewish person, I can fully recognize the way that minority faith traditions are treated. Oftentimes, I know that minority faith traditions are told that they're going to some sort of eternal conscious torment by Christians. They are told, that they are horrifying human beings, that they have no morality, they have no moral compass, that they can't have a moral compass without the Christian idea of God. And unfortunately, that is where we find ourselves. It is a jump from Catholicism. The Catholic Church did this to it's really the Jews' fault. And it is the line really goes from Jews killed Christ. And whenever I say one, I wasn't there. I'm only 47. And two, it was the Romans who actually killed Christ. If you are a believer that the Bible is historically accurate, then it would be the Romans who actually, Pontius Pilate did not like Jews at all. Why would then he take the word of Jews to kill another Jew? None of this has ever made any sense to me, but here we are. And unfortunately, we see that prevalency even in Norse heathen communities.
I think one of the things can I add to that, if I may, Rabbi, is that as an academic who I don't express any public faith at all, I consider myself an atheist, and yet because I deal with these periods and these times, a lot of people have said I'm constantly bashing on about American or Scandinavian pagans as if they're the ones in the wrong. No, the point is I also do a lot of fact-checking misinformation about early medieval Christianity, and given that all our Christian nation states, including the United States, see their origins fantasize their origins in a Christian early medieval nation. In the case of America, multiple nations, but particularly Anglo-Saxon England, but others as well. I assure you, this misinformation isn't being peddled primarily or exclusively by Norse pagans or Germanic heathens. This is a problem with all of our visions of the early Middle Ages, our romanticized or simplified narratives about the early Middle Ages. And I spend a lot of time countering misinformation by Norse pagans because I see so much hope in the informed and engaged nature of Norse pagans on social media compared with certain other groups. That's why I put the effort in, because I see a lot of potential adult, mature conversation, not mature in that sense, but mature as in refined conversations, which I don't see in a lot of other groups. So I just, on a personal level, I want people to understand that I'm talking about these things not only because it's my expertise, but it's not modern Norse pagans that are my personal bugbear and problem. Yes, there are a few extremists and white nationalists and global white supremacists out there within all faith communities. The bigger problem is Christian white nationalism in your country and also in North America. But I'm trying to counter it because it bleeds into each other. So by countering a myth about the origins and the genocide of Norse pagans, I'm also countering Christian misinformation about the origins of Christianity. So it's not one or the other. And for me as an academic, I think, and I speak, I've given up with a lot of my academic colleagues on this. And this is why I prefer to talk to people from faith-based communities who actually seem to be engaging with these questions. I think this is something we can, in a constructive way, do something about, which I don't feel academics have been very effective about. Academics have been very good at blaming ourselves, which I've also done. I've said we've created this problem. Let's blame people who are dead now, but academics from previous generation, or pointing the finger at each other going, oh, well, you could misread that in what you published in 2022 or 2019. But at the end of the day, we're not going to be making any change unless we actually talk to faith-based communities that are actively working against these kind of pernicious narratives. And so I don't want people to think I'm always bashing North American and Scandinavian pagans. No, these are the areas I see of opportunity for constructive conversation with those willing to listen. And of course, there's always people in every community that will take another view. But yes, the misinformation I see about early medieval Judaism, early medieval Islam, early medieval Christianity is just as pernicious. It's just that I can see the potential in a lot of Norse pagan and heathen communities to actually counter this with my expertise.
Thank you so much for lending us that and for your time. We've reached our time, but I am so grateful to both of you guys for being here. My final thought is you had mentioned before about the Viking Age. Your two descriptors were no pizza and no NHS. You just described Chicago. Take that. Just kidding. Not about the NHS thing. I actually do like Chicago pizza. But thank you, Professor Howard Williams, for being here. Thank you, Rabbi Chana, for being here and providing us with just so much context and so much to talk about. And just thank you guys for doing the work that you do. This has been Althing Considered. Everybody have a great night.